Jennifer, you spoke of the world's view of African cities per se. Why do you think that those views are so narrow, and what can be done to combat them?
Well, I think there's a long history of ways of seeing Africa as a place of problems and disaster and so on. And in urban studies, also African cities have been very much aligned with informality and lack of modernity, lack of success, whereas African cities actually have quite a complicated history and plenty of inventive, creative ways of being modern, quite a lot of diversity of experiences. So I think to combat those kinds of stereotypes requires starting to build conceptualizations out of the African context. So to both make sure that we're aware that many other cities all over the world, including places like London, are characterized by things like informality and sort of quite inventive ways of being. Even the heart of the city of London, we read, operates on people schmoozing with one another and rumours and contacts and networking. And so this very African mode of being, presumably. So we can make African stories work in a much bigger way, but also to be very alert to the way in which African cities are made through connections to many parts of the world, have very modern, conventional, formal elements. But on the other hand, we also need to think about how it is that those bring with them all sorts of power relationships and agendas which are not necessarily in the best interests of African cities. So if we think about the habit of creating new satellite cities on the outskirts of cities in Africa, which is very common across Asian cities, for example, large new cities which just suck infrastructure investment away from places where they're really needed. We have to adopt a critical approach to some of those kinds of connections which are shaping cities, as well as letting them help us to think that African cities are diverse and complicated places.
Excellent, thank you. So what you're talking about here is having an Asian model effectively being superimposed on an African city in effect.
It would be a possibility, and it would be a sad outcome, So if you had a sort of British or French colonialism shaping cities in Africa in the past, it would be a real pity to allow these kinds of models to determine the future form of cities in Africa. So, one would hope that maybe we would be able to find some creative alternatives which are a bit different.
Yes. You spoke of different models, obviously, and I assume that means throughout different cultures, but also throughout time. Could you look back and see at a model, perhaps a historical model, and say, well, that is the model by which a city with a high population should grow? Or do you think everyone is different?
Well, I think, cities, even if they're in the same region or the same phase of development, you might say, have quite specific trajectories and pathways. So I think we're really looking to understand that specificity and complexity, but also to recognize that it emerges out of connections, that cities don't exist in isolation. A place like London is made through the presence and work of people from all over the world. So we could think of it as an African city, a Latin American city, and so on, and find ways in which this great cosmopolitan city is being made through ideas from elsewhere. In the same way, African cities too. But I would also say that cities tend to own their complexity and specificity. So a big skyscraper in downtown Joburg, it might in the 1930s be figured as, it's making us just like Chicago. But today, if you cross the Millennium Bridge built to honor Mandela and so on, then you find, this is Joburg. This skyline of these wonderful cities, this is Joburg, and the same in Lagos or whatever. This modern city, which seems so international, perhaps so elsewhere, is in fact, this is it, this is us. So I think that the hurly-burly, the contestation of making cities out of this complicated mix there are opportunities to create cities that people want to live in.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for your time.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you.